Burkina Faso, a landlocked West African nation, known for its resilience, culture, and turbulence. Amid the dry winds and red soil of this troubled region, a boy named Ibrahim Traoré was born in 1988 in Bondakui, Muhun province. No one could have imagined that this boy, from a modest background, would one day ascend to the highest echelons of power in one of Africa's most volatile nations. His journey began far from the corridors of power. Born into a farming family, Traoré grew up with the daily struggles common to many Burkinab: poor infrastructure, limited education, and the shadow of political unrest. But even as a child, there were signs. Signs of a restless mind, a thirst for purpose, a quiet, burning patriotism. He was a quiet boy, always watching, always thinking. He had this way of asking questions, deep questions. By the time he reached secondary school, Ibrahim was already showing signs of leadership. He excelled academically and was particularly drawn to science and mathematics. But more than numbers, it was the story of Burkina Faso's revolutionary past that ignited something deeper in him. He devoured books about Thomas Sankara, the legendary Marxist and Pan-Africanist leader who once led Burkina Faso through a bold and controversial transformation in the 1980s. Sankara's vision of self-reliance, anti-imperialism, and youth empowerment left a lasting impression on the young Traoré. But admiration alone does not shape a revolutionary. The real test came when Ibrahim Traoré decided to join the military. In 2009, he entered the University of Ouagadougou to study geology. But soon, the pull of duty, of action, of something greater, led him to shift course. He joined the army. In the ranks of the Burkina military, he was not just another soldier. Traoré quickly distinguished himself. He was known for his discipline, intelligence, and calm under pressure. He climbed through the ranks, eventually joining the elite artillery regiment. His postings would take him to the most dangerous regions of the country. Montage of dusty patrols, nighttime missions, and quiet moments in the barracks. It was during these missions that he came face to face with the growing threat of jihadist terrorism. The north and east of Burkina Faso were becoming lawless zones. Entire villages were falling under the control of insurgents. Civilians were massacred, soldiers ambushed. The state, it seemed, was retreating. We cannot stand idly by as our people are slaughtered. If those above us will not act, then we must. These words, written to a fellow officer, hinted at the growing disillusionment within the army. A sense of betrayal. They were risking their lives, yet the government in Ouagadougou seemed either incapable or unwilling to match their sacrifice with meaningful leadership. The military was demoralized. Supplies were scarce. Salaries were delayed. And yet, they fought on. For their people. For the land. For honor. This was the crucible that forged Captain Ibrahim Traoré. A leader was rising, not by ambition, but by necessity. Not with bluster, but with resolve. By 2022, the pressure within the military was reaching a breaking point. The government, led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, himself a coup leader, had promised change, but delivered little. The insurgents continued their advance. The people continued to suffer. And the soldiers, they began to whisper. Whispers of rebellion, of yet another coup. And in those whispers, one name kept surfacing. Ibrahim Traoré. By mid-2022, Burkina Faso was teetering. The promise of renewal after the January coup that brought Lieutenant Colonel Damiba to power had withered like leaves under the Sahel sun. Damiba, who once vowed to restore security, now seemed more interested in consolidating power than confronting jihadist insurgents. Among the rank-and-file soldiers, morale plummeted. Missions were sabotaged by poor logistics. Orders from the top felt increasingly disconnected from the battlefield's brutal reality. Frustration fermented like sour millet beer. In hushed conversations between sandbag walls and in encrypted group chats, soldiers expressed what no one dared say aloud. Damiba had failed. Anonymous soldier, voice dramatized, "We didn't fight for this. We didn't risk everything just to replace one weak leader with another." Captain Ibrahim Traoré was at the heart of these conversations. Not as a conspirator, but as a listener, a sounding board. a figure of trust. He shared their anger, their pain, their hope for real transformation. But the tipping point came in September 2022. A deadly attack in the north claimed the lives of dozens of Burkina soldiers. The response from Damiba's administration? Tepid, bureaucratic, and slow. Meanwhile, families grieved and resentment deepened. Rumors swirled. Damiba was losing touch. He had even refused to back junior officers seeking more aggressive strategies. Some believed he was negotiating with the very insurgents killing his soldiers. It was then that the call came. Not from a general, not from a politician, but from the soldiers themselves. They wanted change. Again. And this time, they wanted Captain Ibrahim Traoré to lead it. On the night of September 30th, 2022, armored vehicles rolled into Ouagadougou. Shots rang out in the air. Key government buildings were surrounded. Communications were jammed. The city, already used to coups, held its breath. By dawn, it was over. A young captain, barely known to the outside world, stood before the cameras. Camouflage uniform dusted from travel. Calm, composed, and utterly resolute. Captain Traoré, the current regime has failed to bring security. We have taken our responsibilities in the interest of our nation. Our fight is for the people of Burkina Faso. For some, he was a savior. For others, just another man in uniform making promises. International reactions were swift. ECOWAS condemned the coup. France urged a return to democratic order. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, people chanted his name. Why? Because in Captain Traoré, they saw something rare. Not a career politician, not a detached commander, but a soldier who had bled with them, marched with them, mourned with them. The world watched, wary. But in Burkina Faso, a revolution had just entered a new chapter. October 2022. The dust had barely settled. The coup was done. But the real test, the hardest part, had only just begun. At just 34 years old, Captain Ibrahim Traoré became the youngest head of state in the world. But Burkina Faso was far from a stable country. It was bleeding, scarred, suspicious of authority. He inherited a nation in crisis. Nearly half the country was under threat from jihadist control. Over 2 million citizens had been displaced. Schools had closed, villages emptied, and an entire generation was growing up in fear. In his first national address as president, Traoré stood in his fatigues before a weary nation. Captain Traoré, speech excerpt, "We will not surrender a single inch of our territory to terrorism. This fight is for our survival. We will rise, or we will perish with honor." Cue visuals of citizens listening to radios, soldiers gathered in outposts, women watching from dusty windows. From the beginning, Traoré made it clear. He was not interested in lavish ceremonies or photo ops. He was a man of the field. Within days, he began visiting frontline zones, places where no president had dared go in months. His arrival was often unannounced. He slept where his soldiers slept, ate what they ate. Soldier, he came to the base. No warning. Sat with us. Asked us about our families, our fears. No president ever did that. And he didn't stop there. Traoré launched sweeping military reforms. Old commanders suspected of corruption were dismissed. Supplies were rerouted directly to field units. A volunteer defense force, the VDP, was expanded with rigorous vetting. But the young captain also knew bullets alone wouldn't win this war. He pushed for education to resume in cleared zones. Schools reopened under armed protection. Humanitarian corridors were negotiated. And in a daring move, Traoré began calling for a complete shift in foreign policy. Captain Traoré, speech excerpt, "Our sovereignty is non-negotiable. We will not be dictated to by powers who watched us suffer in silence." This was a clear shot at former colonial ruler France, whose influence in the Sahel had long stirred resentment. By early 2023, he ordered the expulsion of French troops from Burkina Faso. Military agreements were scrapped. French ambassadors recalled. For some, this was reckless. For others, it was liberation. And then came the pivot to new allies. Burkina Faso deepened ties with Mali and Guinea, two other countries now led by military men. Together, they formed a new Sahel bloc, a coalition forged not by diplomacy, but shared trauma and ambition. And quietly, Traoré opened channels with Russia. Wagner Group mercenaries were rumored to be operating in the region. Arms shipments increased. Training camps expanded. While Traoré denied any formal alliance, analysts whispered otherwise. In a world gripped by geopolitical chess, the young captain had just moved his first major piece. But not everything was progress. There were cracks. Some human rights groups accused his forces of abuses in counterinsurgency operations. Journalists critical of the regime faced growing pressure. Protests, once rare, began bubbling in the cities, calling for accountability and transparency. Civilian activist, we want security. Yes. But we want freedom, too. We cannot trade one uniform for another. Traoré remained silent on many criticisms. He insisted the war demanded unity and sacrifice. Yet, even his supporters began to ask, how long would this war justify everything? As 2023 turned to 2024, one question hung in the air like dust at dusk. Would Captain Ibrahim Traoré remain a liberator or become just another strongman? 2024. The war had not ended, but neither had the hope. For every village reclaimed, for every school reopened, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's legend grew. He was no longer just a soldier or a president. To many, he was a symbol of defiance, of courage, of renewal. But symbols, like people, crack under pressure. As the conflict dragged on, the costs mounted. Economically, the country was teetering. Burkina Faso's currency reserves were drying up. Foreign investors fled. Inflation crept into markets. Bread, rice, even basic fuel became harder to afford. And while the war dominated headlines, a quieter conflict stirred behind palace walls. Factions began forming within the military. Some senior officers resented Traoré's youth and centralization of power. Others feared his pivot to Russia would isolate Burkina Faso from critical Western aid. Even among his allies, questions grew. How long could they fight on all fronts? Militarily, diplomatically, economically? Former insider, there were whispers. Meetings behind closed doors. Some spoke of a transitional plan. Others, of replacing him. Internationally, the pressure intensified. The United Nations released reports alleging human rights violations by the VDP. France pushed for sanctions. ECOWAS threatened to suspend Burkina Faso entirely. And then, a crisis struck. In late 2024, jihadists launched their boldest attack yet, targeting multiple regions simultaneously. Hundreds were killed. A military base was overrun. Traoré, caught between political maneuvering and the battlefield, faced his worst nightmare, a collapse in morale. But from the ashes of defeat came a renewed resolve. Traoré went dark for 3 days. Rumors swirled. Was he overthrown? Wounded? Fled? Then, footage emerged. Captain Traoré, they want you to think we are defeated. But we are here. With you. Until the end. The message was clear. He had not run. He had returned to the front. In the weeks that followed, a counteroffensive was launched. Supported by regional allies and a revitalized VDP, the insurgents were pushed back from key zones. Grain convoys reached starving villages. Water pumps were repaired. A fragile sense of order returned. But Traoré knew security was not victory, and Burkina Faso was not yet healed. So, he made a surprising announcement. Captain Traoré, we must prepare for the future. A Burkina Faso led not by one man in uniform, but by the will of its people. He called for a national dialogue. Civilian leaders, religious figures, youth movements, all were invited to shape a transitional charter. It would be the first step, he said, toward democratic elections by 2025. Skeptics scoffed. Western powers remained cautious. But inside Burkina Faso, something shifted. The fear began to lift. And with it, a question even his critics had to ask. What if Traoré was serious? For now, the war continues. The nation remains fragile. But so does its hope. And hope, in the Sahel, is more powerful than bullets. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Soldier. Leader. ? The story is not over. In fact, it may have just begun. A nation once suffocating under fear and foreign interference is now rising, not just with hope, but with purpose. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso has reclaimed its voice, its dignity, its future. He didn't just promise change, he delivered it. Corrupt elites were dismantled. Foreign military influence curbed. The economy, once paralyzed by chaos, began to breathe again. Local industries were empowered. Gold revenues, once siphoned off, now fed into schools, clinics, and clean water projects. Security improved. The volunteer defense forces were reorganized, better trained, and made accountable. Communities once abandoned to terror now raise their flags in freedom. And for the first time in decades, Burkina felt ownership over their own destiny. In April 2025, the Transitional Charter was finalized. A civilian electoral commission was established. Political prisoners were freed, exiled journalists returned, and public discourse reopened. Even those who doubted him now admit, Traoré achieved what few dared attempt, rebuilding a broken nation from the ground up. Still, questions remain. Can one man's vision endure beyond his presence? Can a revolution truly give way to stable democracy? Only time will answer. But today, across dusty villages and crowded markets, children speak his name not with fear, but with pride. Captain, reformer, son of the soil. He may not have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, Burkina Faso is asking the right questions, out loud and unafraid. This is not the end. It is the rebirth of a nation.
Burkina Faso President Ibrahim Traoré has announced a project to build free houses for every citizen, promising to end homelessness in the country. He declared that no one in Burkina Faso should live without shelter and that the government will build homes for all.
You've just witnessed another chapter from the crossroads of power, where some rose as legends and others fell as tyrants. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, soldier, patriot, symbol, didn't wait for history to remember him. He carved his name into it. In a world chained by foreign greed and local betrayal, he dared to stand tall. Not as a ruler, but as a reminder that Africa still breathes fire. To every young African watching this, the future does not belong to the timid. It belongs to the bold, to those who learn, to those who rise, to those who speak, even when the world tells them to stay silent. Imperialism hasn't ended, it's only changed faces. But so has the resistance. So rise, with vision, with courage, with unity. Rise like Traoré, not for fame, but for freedom. Know your heroes, expose your tyrants, and above all, become the story they fear to forget. This is Legends and Tyrants. Subscribe for more untold stories from Africa's frontlines. Like if you believe in the power of truth. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Comment your thoughts. We read every word. The revolution is not televised, but it is uploaded.